It is that time for another episode of Beyond Reform, where we discuss matters relevant to building a better public sector in Jamaica. I'm your host, Aniki Clark, and today we are discussing performance management with an expert panel. Dr. David Knight, who is the Director of HR at the Jamaica Information Service, Ms. Annette Osborne, Senior Director of Human Resource Management and Development at the Police Department in the Ministry of National Security, and Mr. O'Neill Grant, who was recently appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Jamaica Employers Federation, but most persons would know him as former President of the Jamaica Civil Service Association. Welcome, lady and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is usually, a thorn amongst the roses, but now we're seeing a rose amongst the thorns.
Wow.
But if we could get things started, Dr. Knight, for those persons who may not fully appreciate what we are talking about, the subject of performance management, could you explain for them what exactly do we mean when we say performance management?
Well, performance management is a process or a system, and normally we talk about performance management system or performance management appraisal system. And the whole objective of this is to ensure that organizations arrange work in such a way that you get the right results. Put it simply, so you organize what it is. It's a company. Well, for us, it's government, ministries, agencies, and departments. We have objectives which the government set. We talk about strategic objectives. We talk about our business plan, corporate plan. So you have this big objective, and you have to break that down to a ministry level, to a department level, down to a divisional level, a unit level, down to the individual. And what you really want is to have a fancy word is alignment, but it means everything line up. It means that it connects. So let us say you need to make books, and your objective is to make 500 books, but this is not communicated clearly to the staff. They don't have the resources to do it, and they don't know the timeline within which to do it. They make 500 books, but they take a year to make it, whereas the entity need to make 500 books in 6 months so that it can be sold to people and you earn the income by month 9. So it has to be aligned. It is making sure that there is clarity about what is required. Because you may be working, but you are not achieving the result that is required. So the management system is to help the organization and help the employees to get the results that are required. And you need to get that by ensuring that it's clear, that it's realistic, that there are the resources to support it, and you have the necessary mechanisms to track the outcome that you want. So I'll just use this last analogy. When I started working in the public service, we used to have what we call performance appraisal. And so there's this long form and different forms for different groups. But you get rated more on things like personality and qualifications and so forth. But that has nothing to do. It doesn't measure. It doesn't impact the results necessarily. Performance management is going to set some objectives at every level, departmental level, the ministerial agency level, down to the individual level. And so that is why it's important. You need that clarity to make sure that we get the results we want. The public want results. And I'll say this last thing. When you have a good system in place, it protects the employee. We'll have less complaints about I did this and I didn't get a good score, because if you write it properly, then we know what you should be doing. You know what you should be doing. And if you do it, the evidence should be there that you have done it.
And does the employee contribute to shaping that particular objective?
I believe so. But remember, if the objectives are set at the higher level, then you can't redefine that. You have to know, organize. Management has to organize how you get the employees to work to do it. And you look at their skills, you look at the resources they need, you look if they need training. So the management system is not just about production, it's also about developing the staff, It's about coaching the staff, monitoring. You don't wait until the end of the year and say, Annette, you never finished this. You should be talking to me along the way and helping me to achieve superior performance, not just basic performance.
Awesome. And Ms. Osborne, I'm going to shift to you. How is performance managed in the public sector?
So performance is managed in the public sector by having a continuous process which helps employees perform at their best and align with the organization goals, as David mentioned before. So what normally happens is that at the beginning of the financial year, goals are set. And these goals are aligned to the government bigger picture. And it's filtered down to up to the office attendant by way of work plans. So we have performance appraisal. The work plan that is done is an agreement between the staff and the employee and the employer. So I'll give you an example. I remember doing a work plan for somebody in the registry, and I told him that I needed the files to be updated every day at the end of the day, not knowing the volume of work that is being done in the unit. So the person came back to me to say, it can't happen every other day. So I said, why? Because if I do this, I won't be able to do that. And that's more critical. If you ask me for a file, then what do I do? Don't bring the files. So it's an agreement, a contractual
conversation.
Right, that you must have with your employee and the employer. Of course, out of this, you have coaching and mentoring. You have training, that continuous training, and all of this is aligned to the bigger picture. That's the most important thing. And of course, you have to constantly monitor the staff, observing the staff, and then it depends on the person. If it's a new person for the job, then you know it would be maybe like on a quarterly basis. But if you have the person who have been doing this job over time, then you need to observe, provide your coaching, and maybe at the end of the year, an annual evaluation is done. And we don't forget the reward and recognition. Reward and recognition is not only monetary, a pat on the shoulder. You tell the staff, you're doing a good work. Mark you. There's a flip side to that. Because if the staff is not performing, their sanction. So that's how it's basically managed in the public service.
Okay, so there's an annual, you have the work plan setting, annual appraisal. Is there an interim arrangement during that?
You have interim, you have quarterly, you have half yearly, and of course, you must have the annual arrangement.
And that will identify my training needs and so on.
Right, it feeds into the training plan, which is needed for the budget. It's a whole big picture, so you have the strategic plan, you have the operational plan, then it goes down to the unit plan, then the work plan for the individual. So it trickles right down. It's alignment with the government bigger picture.
You've been in the public sector for quite some time.
And I won't tell you how long.
What's your assessment of performance management systems in the public sector?
Okay, as it is now, in the public sector, you have, I think, around 3 or 4. So you have the PMIS. The PMIS is the Performance Monitoring and Evaluation System. This is at the more strategic level. This is where the government uses performance feedback to help the government improve its results. Then you have the Performance Management Appraisal System that came in 2006. That's what we are currently using. But it is depending on the organization because you can customize. With that, you'd have the job description. Every position in government have a job description. Then every person in government, every employee ought to have a work plan and a competency framework document. And of course, at the end of the period, either quarterly, the interim, the half yearly, or basically this is done for everybody, the 12 months, a performance evaluation report. Then, of course, in the agencies, you have the KPIs, which is the key performance indicators. And they set their own KPIs. And in some agencies, in the public sector, you might have a performance indicator matrix. And this is a different matrix performance indicator. It depends on maybe the entity. But in central government, we tend to use the performance appraisal system, the PMAS.
And do you think it has been working to have these different systems measuring performance?
Yes, it has been working. I will tell you, in the company that I am now, we have both SORN and SORN. We have embraced the PMAS. And what we do is continuous training. In every program that is done at the training school, there's a part for HR to do a presentation on performance management. Because we are dealing with people. We're not dealing with furniture. We're dealing with people, and you have to have that constant feedback, because the person who is actually doing the work, though you have the management, that's the person who you need to get the feedback from. They're on the ground. So the conversation it's a continuous conversation. And that's a change in the new. David mentioned the first performance management thing that speaks about personality and all of that. This speaks to the heart of the persons. Persons are motivated. And once the resources are given, persons will perform. But it is working. It needs a little tweaking here and there, but it is working.
And I suppose one of the persons who can tell us from both perspectives whether it is serving both interests is Mr. Grant. I'm going to ask you now, O'Neill, having been on the side of representing workers and now on the other side of looking out for the interests of employers, is there a way to balance the expectations and the needs of the employer and the employee? How do we achieve that?
Okay, first we have to recognize the context of performance management. For me, it has been and always has been, it is and always has been what we refer to as constraint management. Every worker has limitations. And the worker themselves, if you look at a system, any workplace system, the worker is the weak link in that system because we are human beings. And we are prone to illnesses, unexpected breakdowns, if you look at how systems work. So, and we have different levels of performance that is born out of biological, ideological, all sorts of issues that cannot be managed. So you now look at the constraint to the worker's productivity. And this is basically what it comes to. We develop output-focused job descriptions and say that, these are the outputs that we expect from you. But we generally don't look at the finer details of the human being, the individuals themselves, until we sit them down and we go through the targets. And then in that conversation, the worker will say, well, I can't meet this target because of... It may be that the other factors of that person's productivity may not be in place. So we want them to produce X amount of something, but we don't give them the resources to do so. Then the results is not the system itself. It's the weakness within the individual, within the system, that they can't produce more than they ought to because they have not been properly resourced. So when we look at performance management, we look at it in the context of the theory of constraints and look at it in the perspective that how do we manage somebody, an individual who is operating within a system that is subject to all sorts of influences and interference outside of the world of work? Most performance management systems don't go that deep. They look at the output and expect that people must meet the output. And if you don't meet the output,
there are consequences.
Though some have gone far enough to look at competencies and use that now to balance whether or not the employee has the requisite skills and competencies to perform at the level that they should. And based on that, you set the targets that they should meet, the indicators of whether or not the person has performed to their expectation. But there's still also the issue that the organization has its own matrices that it should meet. And in order for it to determine whether or not it can meet its overall targets, you set different targets for different people, even though they are carrying out the same function. Because we recognize that as the constraint manager, the manager who's the constraint manager needs to know that his resource, which is a human resource, are properly calibrated based on the system that they're working in. So you might give this person 10 of a target to do while you give another person 5 because you recognize that there is a constraint that needs to be managed. And most good managers are able to recognize the constraint and effectively manage the constraint, and they are able to now get a larger output. And this happens both anywhere in any system. You take a systems-based approach to managing performance, look at it as a productivity issue with constraint management theory applied, and then you will recognize how effective the application of that theory is in managing performance. And we have various experiences of persons who are excellent performers that you don't have to do much to get them to meet their targets, while you have others who you have to apply a little bit more in terms of being hands-on, in terms of taking them, sitting them down, giving them assurances and motivation and doing a little bit more work, because you recognize the constraint there and you have to manage that constraint, because at the end of the day, when that staff fails to perform and the unit targets are not met, who has to report? The manager. And the report of the manager is the outcome of whether they have managed that constraint as good as they ought to have been. Sometimes you have to get rid of the weakness. And that is something that also impacts the system within which that manager operates.
Then, sticking with that theory, how then do you think employees would view it, especially within the context of being fair, that it is about my ability as opposed to what is expected of the job and supporting me to be at the level to which I need to perform?
And that's why we have mentoring, coaching. When you, as a manager, recognize that an employee, through the assessment, through the performance management assessment system, you recognize that an employee has certain weaknesses. You identify the weaknesses, you identify the gaps, you put special programs in place to ensure that you can maximize the output from that individual, knowing that they may still have limitations, which has to be dealt with over time. So it is a complex science, not something that can be taught, but the good manager is going to be able to identify those constraints and to not solve them, but to have workarounds to have them not be so central in the operations that they are a part of.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And David, when we talk about a performance culture, what are we talking about?
Before I answer that, I'd like to just touch something O'Neill raised. When you have these expectations, there are standards for performance for each job. If you want the employee to deliver, you need to really start from the recruitment level. You have to recruit the person with the right skill, the right talent, the right qualification, and the continuous training, because ultimately a performance management system is to encourage superior performance. So it's how you encourage, and you do that by ensuring the alignment. We all talk about that.
Right.
And so in terms of the culture now, it's a mind shift for a lot of employees. Some people just come to work, come 8 o'clock or 8:30, or leave at 5. But what do we achieve during that time? So it's not just about doing the tasks that you are trained to do. Are you doing it to the standard? Are you doing it within the time? Are we doing it within budget? So changing the mindset is critical to creating the culture, a performance culture. And how you get that, there is a term which says what gets measured gets done. So when we agree, when we go down to that granular level, and it says on the work plan, and persons know what they need to do, and they know that if you do this, the result going to be, let's use a scale of 1 to 5. If you are performing below standard, your rating is less than 3. If you're performing within the expected range, you're at a 3. If you are above, you're at a 4. If you're maxing it out, you're at a 5. I mean, we can translate this to 100%, so on and so forth. And depending on which entity you are in, then there is a reward system for it. It affects how your increment is
or
paid,
promoted,
or if there's some bonus in the organization, because different government organizations, and it's primarily to central government, ministries and agencies, but you have others which have over time refined their performance management system, because you have to incentivize. They say money don't motivate, but it does motivate some persons. Because when you know that performing above the basic going to give you maybe 2 increments instead of 1, it's a driver, and it means a lot. And so it's like getting paid for results. You know, that's what, and agencies have that issue. If you don't perform to a certain level, you may not get the resources you need that you say you want next year. Okay. But if you perform, if you're a performing agency, then you get results. You get the support. And so we want that. You want that at the individual level. And if you have people performing, use the reward and recognition. Give them that letter of commendation. Right. Recommend them for awards. Recommend them for citations. And of course, everybody wants the money, and that's where you come in and compensation.
No. All right, I want to go back to something you said about persons coming to work and working 8 to 5 and so on. A lot of people, COVID altered the way we work.
Yes.
And a lot of people struggling with measuring and managing performance with remote work. What advice as an HR practitioner would you give to someone who must now manage a workforce that is in our...
Right. Well, I know a lot of workers today would rather to work hybrid. I hear that every day. But not every job in the organization can be done hybrid, and we have to be mindful of that. The key is, whether hybrid or in office, the key is, what is the output? What is the outcome? What is the result that is required? Because I could be in office, you said, we're not having any remote work. Everybody has to come in, and everybody come in, whether they come in 8 o'clock, 8:30, whatever time, and I leave 5, whatever the time. Right. But you don't get the result. Right. And somebody may be able, their job may allow them to work remotely, where instead of spending maybe hour and a half in traffic in the morning, they could stay home, log on, do the work. Just put the systems in place that you can measure that they are doing the work. If you need them to log in at a particular time so you know that they sign in, there are softwares which can be put on the PC that they work. So you put the system, and it's not unique to government. There are private companies where people work remotely sometime, full-time or part-time, but they can't slack off because the software measures whether they are working or not, and it can't be just hitting keys. You have to deliver. You have meetings, you have online meetings, you have reports to deliver. Other people are depending on you. So we have to look in a dispassionate but at the same time a strategic way. What is the best way to work? What is the best way to organize the work? And if remote work can give you a lift in performance, where some people don't have to struggle with the traffic, for example.
As I did getting here.
Or maybe they have some unique situations in the family, and you can assist them to deal with that home situation, which would stress them out if they came in, and allow them to work remotely, maybe 2 days a week, maybe 3 days, or so on, but put the measures in place. So it's something we have to think about, and not just about everybody has to be here. And what you're doing is really marking attendance. You're not measuring performance. Right. We have to shift the mind and shift the culture. Get focus on the performance, focus on the results, focus on the output, focus on the impact, not on attendance only.
And how do we get to that change in mindset, Annette? You're with your colleagues on the ground.
First, we have to look at leadership. The leadership needs to be held accountable. And I say this because, going back, PMAS was implemented in 2006. And I'm certain to date, some organizations don't have PMAS. They are doing their own thing. If you hold leadership accountable, leadership will bring the staff. And leadership is not only at the top, they have to come down, and we have other leadership down the bottom and embrace, and we have to continuously having this conversation. I remember in an entity that I work, when we introduced PMAS, when you went into the restroom, you saw PMAS in there. Everywhere in the organization was PMAS. Everybody embraced.
You mean signs?
The sign promoting the PMAS. Okay. So you'll see what PMAS means. Performance appraisal system, what it is about. So going to wash your hand and you look up to see yourself in the mirror, you see PMAS, you say, my God. You turn on your computer. Normally persons put their pictures on the computer, but you see PMAS come right in your face. So we sell it and you embrace it. Sensitization is a must, and you communicate this thing that you want to have. It's a good system to have. It motivates staff. Persons are motivated. David mentioned some stuff. O'Neill also mentioned some stuff. It motivates staff, reward and recognition. But what is important with this PMAS is a continuous feedback, that dialogue between the employee and the employer. That must be in place. And training and development is critical. Okay, back in the days when the recruitment was going on with the personnel officers, so we had persons with experience. You might have 1 or 2 persons with a good degree, but now in 2024, going forward, we have a cadre of qualified and competent HR practitioners. O'Neill mentioned about mind. When we have a new performance appraisal system in place, I'm sure Mind will do some retraining, resensitization, but we have the persons in-house to make it happen. O'Neill also mentioned about the performance appraisal system that we have. You have an opportunity for the individual to write their career path. So the person might start working in the registry, and they have gone ahead and they did their degree in accounts, finance. So they'll write to say that within 3 years, they hope to reach in the finance department. That helps HR to shape that person's career path, get them where they are. Because you really don't want a round peg in a square peg in a round hole. It does not work. You'd have to hammer it down. So with that, you have persons also, as you mentioned, you have rotation policy. So you might have to rotate persons out, put them somewhere where they're not really comfortable. I don't like the word persons comfortable in their job. They don't really perform when they're too comfortable in their job. Sometimes persons need to be challenged, put other places, and they do a much better job. I've seen it where I am. Sometimes I move persons around, move them out of their comfort zone, and they perform exceptionally well in the other area, because some persons are afraid to make that step, that shift, that culture that David spoke about. Persons are afraid if they're not aware where they're going.
Mm-hmm. So O'Neill, how do we get to that place in the society where performance in the public sector and just, generally is spoken of in a positive way?
There's an education that needs to be done. And for both the employer and the employee, we tend to focus more on the appraisal itself and the outcome of that rather than on the entire system of performance management. And everything that we have been speaking of this morning is actually speaking to the system of performance management rather than the appraisal itself, because the employer and the employee and the public looking on will always say, all these public sector workers keep on getting increments whether or not the organization meets its targets or not. And the employee saying that I work hard, I produce more than I'm ought to producing with the resources I have, and I deserve my compensation. And the employer is saying, well, even though the organization never met its targets, the workers have met theirs, and so I have to now ensure that they are rewarded. And so we look at the performance appraisal system and the outcome of that rather than the performance management system that is supposed to be there, the appraisal document and the appraisal process rather than the management system. Because if people focus on the management system, they will recognize that when we refer to as total factor productivity, if the other aspects of the productivity spectrum is not up to date or up to speed, we can't penalize the worker. And the public has to understand this as well, that when we are talking about managing performance and appraising people based on performance, if the other factors of production are not there, if we don't have the resources to buy the laptops, to put new systems in place, to ensure that the workers have the resources that they need to improve their performance, the country will continuously have a productivity issue. If I look at it from a commercial standpoint, there was an anecdote that went around to say that, when Jamaican businesses were busy using the proceeds of their businesses to buy houses and cars. The Trinidadians came here and invested in machinery and improved the productive cycle so that they are now making much more money. It is about what you put into your system and the output that you expect to get from it. Some people are very comfortable with just getting what they are getting now and asking the worker to do more. Some persons were saying, I want my workers to be able to produce more. So when I look at what productivity means, input, output, if I can get somebody, instead of using a fork and a pickaxe to fork up a 1 acre plot of land, I invest in a tractor and they can fork up that same piece of land with much more efficiency than using the pickaxe and the fork. Yes. And that is how we have to look at and educate the country about what those productivity mean. It's not just about labor productivity. That's one aspect of it. It is total factor productivity. And until we reach that point where we look at total factor productivity as a country, we will be struggling with productivity as a country because the individual works hard. The average Jamaican, whether it's in the public or in the private sector, because of how our systems are designed, that you have to meet your targets. And if you don't meet your targets, you're going to be penalized. You say that the workers are not working, but the system that we have is if the worker doesn't produce, they are subject to penalty. But we don't recognize that we're giving that worker pickaxes and forks to fork up the land rather than giving them tractors. Right. If you look at all the productive societies around the world, what do? They invest in technology. And technology does not replace people, just makes them work more efficiently. Now, when we look at, and just to segue a little bit into a thought that was shared, when we look at persons now working in a remote environment, the remote environment is a digital environment, and we are using analog systems to evaluate and monitor performance in a digital space. It can't work. And that is why we always hear people saying that my manager wants to see me at work. It's not because they necessarily want to see you at work, but they don't have the wherewithal to properly monitor and evaluate the work that you're doing. So unless they see you produce a written report, they don't know that you have produced, and they have to see you doing the work to determine whether or not you're actually on the job doing the work. Now, if we want to ensure that we can effectively and efficiently operate in that digital space, we have to ensure that we move away from analog performance monitoring and evaluation systems. And David spoke about it. There are technologies that allows persons to be able to effectively monitor without you having to be sitting there and doing it. You can actually pull up and see what is happening at an audit report that tells you everything that the individual did, how many click rates that they did, when they logged on, when they logged off, without having to be sitting there and having these systems that is purely hands-on.
But sometimes, only some of those managers must be trained to manage these systems. So they fall back on what they know.
I've been on both sides in terms of being a worker and being a manager. And I will say that in government, based on my experience, that the most trained pool of persons that you have in this country is in the public sector. We have an organization called the Management Institute for National Development that has developed significant systems and training protocols to equip our managers to be the best managers in this country. But it is underspoken of. When you look at the training that we get in the public sector, it is beyond what any company gives to their managers. And I think our managers do themselves a disservice sometimes when they get the training and they don't come back and apply the training or be more entrepreneurial in applying the training. Because yes, we're operating in the public sector in a rules-based environment, but that doesn't mean that you cannot manage the rules to get what you need, because there is space within the rules to get what you need. And so when we hear people talk about the public sector being too rules-based for them to be more entrepreneurial, I say, no, you can be more entrepreneurial based on how the rules give you the space to work. So I believe that our managers can be a little bit more inventive, a little bit more creative in terms of how they apply the rules within the public sector. Let's take about how responsive we were during the COVID-19 pandemic and how we did not use the rules that we have to allow persons to work properly. So you have flexible work arrangements that was in the public sector from 2004. But most managers were afraid, or what have you, I don't know, to apply flexible work arrangements in the public sector. So you have staff who would turn up to work because they have to drop off their children at 7 o'clock in the morning. So we're talking about a productivity issue now. We have people that turn up to work at 7 o'clock in the morning because they have to get their children to school by 7:30. So they're at the office. They can't even enter the building because the rules are there that nobody must enter the office before a certain time. And so even if they try to use their pass card to enter, the system blocks them out. They can't go in. So they sit in their cars and do nothing and wait until the office opens. And then at 2 o'clock, they have to leave to go to school to pick up their children and then battle traffic to come back to the office. You realize how much time we have wasted already. So if you have a system where if the person comes to work at 7, they work the entire 8 hours for the day and are able to leave at 3 o'clock to pick up their children, they have had a full productive day and would have blended that into their work-life balance because of how we set up the systems. That is already, the rules are in the books to allow for it to happen. But we don't because, again, we're operating in a analog way in a digital space.
Yeah. And just for our listeners, the next discussion will be on productivity. It came up quite a bit in this conversation, which tells us that, there's a relationship between how you manage performance and the productivity that is achieved. But I want to thank you, lady and gentlemen, for a very interesting discussion. I certainly appreciated the perspectives that you brought to the conversation. O'Neill Grant of the Jamaica Employers Federation, David Knight of the Jamaica Information Service, and Annette Osborne from the Police Department in the Ministry of National Security. Until next time, listeners, take care and catch you when we have the productivity conversation next time.